I'm Lisa Stone. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Parenting Aces.
Well, it's been a crazy couple of weeks, and I thought I was going to get y'all a new episode of the podcast last week, but that didn't happen. And then I was out in Los Angeles for a long weekend, getting back really late last night. And so getting a new podcast recorded and edited and online for y'all this week didn't happen either. But good news is that we are doing a throwback podcast for this week, and I have with us Carlos Goffi, and this is a podcast recorded several years ago. Carlos is an incredible coach. He coached John McEnroe. He coached Mary Carillo. He's got an incredible history in the sport. And I'm really excited to bring him back to you guys. For those who've been listening to the Parenting Aces podcast for a while, you may remember hearing my interview with Carlos. And if so, I hope this is an enjoyable refresher for you. For those of you new to the podcast or relatively new to the podcast, this will be your first time listening, but this conversation with Carlos was recorded back in 2013, so it's a few years old, but the lessons that Carlos imparts are still very, very applicable, very useful today, and so I hope you will enjoy hearing from this incredible coach. And it's really funny to go back and listen to this for me because we actually recorded the podcast while I was driving back from Mobile, Alabama with my son in the car. So it was one of those crazy tournament weekends, and Carlos was very, very accommodating as I navigated my way back to Atlanta and tried to be a good interviewer all at the same time. Please sit back, relax, enjoy the podcast, and I really and truly hope to have a new episode up and online for y'all next week. But in the meantime, here's Carlos Goffi.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Parenting Aces radio show on Blog Talk Radio's UR Tennis Network. I'm your host, Lisa Stone, and I'm actually coming live at you from the Marriott in Mobile, Alabama, where we are just heading home after a long, hot, humid weekend of tennis with my son. So it is going to be kind of a crazy show this morning as I drive and broadcast and hopefully stay on my cell service as we're driving from Mobile. But please know we have an awesome show for you today. My guest is Carlos Goffi, who is a former professional player from Brazil, a former coach of John McEnroe, Mary Carillo, and others, and the author of Tournament Tough. And Carlos, are you on the air with us?
I sure am. It is a pleasure to be here with you, Lisa.
Well, thank you so much. Okay, y'all are getting ready to hear the ding of the elevator as we head down, and the elevator at the Mobile Marriott talks to you as you ride in it. So if you hear a strange voice, that's what it is. So, Carlos, while I'm riding down the elevator, will you please give our listeners a history of your life in tennis? And, I mean, it's so extensive. I was reading some biographical info on you, and I'm just blown away at the extent of your involvement in the tennis world. But if you want to start with your years growing up in Brazil and take us from there.
Well, that would be a pleasure. First of all, Lisa, thank you very much for inviting me to be on your show. You are truly a tennis parent, I guess, taking on this commendable lead to have this blog show on junior tennis. Back when I wrote the book Tournament Tough in the 80s, I wish there was such a thing as a blog talk tennis to other parents that are going through what you're going through. Normally it's new to a lot of the parents.
Right.
And normally, the majority of the parents that are trying to do the very best for their kids, of course, as we all do as parents, haven't had any manual to read about how to be a tennis parent and what goes on with junior tennis and so forth and so on. So it was interesting that you have taken this lead to have this show. I think is excellent, and I congratulate you for it. I am not
Thank you
really.
so much.
Absolutely. I'm not really up on today's social media. I am 60 years old, so I'm still one of those dinosaurs that keep still fighting, tweeting and Facebook, and I apologize for that, but it's one of those things that I still have not perfected myself. But I'm glad to be here with you in this social media network and hopefully reach a lot of parents that are out there doing the same thing that, believe me, has been done for 100 years, and I remember myself, as you were saying, take me back to Brazil. Well, I was 5 years old, and my father was the president of the São Paulo Tennis Club. And as the son of the president of the tennis club, I had no choice but to start taking lessons from the pro at the club. And of course, 5 years later of taking lessons and just playing within the club, I started to play my first tennis tournament when I was 10. And of course, from that point on, I caught the bug and played tennis every day of my life almost since I was 10 years old, and junior tennis throughout Latin America. And then when I was about 17 years old, I came to play the Orange Bowl in December. And that was, at that point, the World Championships for junior tennis. There was no internet, as you know. We're talking back in 1969 or 70, somewhere in there. And the Orange Bowl was known as the World Championships of Tennis. So 64 countries sent their two best junior players for a 128 draw. And you had a draw of the Orange Bowl at that time that was composed of all of these countries, all of these players, and whoever actually won the Orange Bowl that year was the number one junior player in the world, because there was no rankings, there were no computers. So imagine if you had a cold, or if you were not feeling too good on your stomach that particular week before Christmas, and you could very well be the number one player in the world in juniors, but if you lost, if you didn't win that Orange Bowl, you were not going to be ranked in the world.
Right.
So a little history here for the tennis parents that are out there dealing with all of these new ranking formats and computer points and all of that stuff. When I started out, obviously, there was nothing of that. In fact, I'll take you to the next step, a little history. Back when, so after I played the Orange Bowl, I was shocked because, again, there was no education, no knowledge in those days about American student-athletes scholarships. I recall that there were only 3 Brazilians at that point that had actually been, they were studying in the United States as student-athletes. So it was something that was totally new for us as foreigners back in those days. We had no knowledge, no internet to do any research or to educate yourself. So during the Orange Bowl, I was shocked to see all of these coaches from the American colleges out there recruiting these foreign players. And I was actually offered something like a ridiculous number of, I think, 18, 20 scholarships to stay in the United States and play college tennis. So that was a major decision for a boy from Brazil at 17, not knowing what to do, not speaking English, calling my parents in São Paulo and say, they are offering me the scholarship. Maybe I like to stay here. And so it was a very dramatic experience in those days, I recall, as being here. But I ended up choosing to go to college in Texas. As a matter of fact, at that time, it was called the University of Corpus Christi. even though I had scholarships offers for other more major universities, what led me to Corpus Christi was that the two players that were number one and number two there, they were the Davis Cup players for Venezuela, and I had actually played against them during the South American Championships years before they were here. So knowing that I knew somebody, or these two players, that was really I based my decision on where to go to college, just because two of my old buddies were there, without having an idea where Corpus Christi was, an idea of the size of the university, the academic level of the university. Nothing mattered at that point. It was just like to play tennis at a university in the United States. And these two guys were the only two guys that I knew, and I went there. Amazingly enough, University of Corpus Christi was a small little college that was a private Baptist school of 1,800 students only, kind of like almost a high school, really.
Wow.
Did not have tennis courts on campus. Campus was beautiful, right off Ocean Boulevard out there in Corpus Christi. It's right by the ocean. The campus, really nice, small campus. But here I am, 17 years old, just arriving in Corpus Christi, Texas, and going to this college, and had no idea what was. And the program was actually put together by the coach, Mr. Bob Mapes. And Coach Mapes was the tennis director of the public park in downtown Corpus Christi, HEB Tennis Center. You probably heard of HEB Tennis Center. It's a major tennis center in terms of national tennis centers as well. And many tournaments are played there at HEB Tennis Center. Well, the Coach Mapes was the coach there. And he was the pro there at HEB Tennis Center, and he actually had 6 daughters. So he decided to put together a men's tennis team for the University of Corpus Christi, so that he would have also these 6 boys that would be like his 6 sons, actually, okay? And, it was incredible. It was incredible. Here it is, this elderly man for us. I mean, those days when I was 17, 18, Coach Mapes must have been older than I am now. I'm 60.
Wow.
And he was basically a family, of his wife Nancy and her and their 6 daughters, and here we are, their sons, the 6 players of the tennis team, and for you to have an idea how incredible that experience was for me, we were during the 3 years that I was there, we were number 3, number 5, and number 7 in the nation in Division I. For a little school that did not have any other athletics or not even their own tennis courts. Imagine.
That's amazing. So who were you all playing? Which other schools did you play in your conference?
There was no conference. We played against everybody in the country. There were the top Division I schools. Back in those days, for instance, you may not know this, but in the 60s, as you probably know, California schools dominated tennis, the Southern Cals and the Stanfords and the UCLAs of the world in the 60s. Well, in the 70s, it shifted to Texas. The number 1 team in the country then was Trinity in San Antonio. And Trinity in San Antonio today is a Division III school, I believe. Corpus Christi, we were number 3 in the nation in Division I, and I believe now the tennis team now is called the Texas A&M or Texas A&I at Corpus Christi, which has nothing to do really with what we were in those days. And University of Houston was with the top 10. SMU was the top 10. Rice University was the top 10. So we had basically in the early 70s when I was playing my college tennis, we had the majority of the schools in the top 10 in Division I were actually Texas schools.
That's amazing. So y'all really didn't even have to travel that far to get some incredible competition.
That's for sure. Well, though we did have a similar schedule as the colleges have today. Spring tennis, we would start playing our duels early in January, and then of course we would finish with the NCAA in May. And fall was very unstructured. Fall tennis in those days in college tennis was very unstructured, and was really up to us to basically take care of ourselves. So a lot has changed in college tennis since then. As you probably know, my son now is the coach of the University of South Carolina, and it's amazing. I'm keeping up right now with all of the NCAA rules, through my son, because he has to, of course, be on top of those rules to do the job that he has. But
brag on your son a minute, because he just won Coach of the Year.
I was going to leave that for a little bit later, because it is a matter of tremendous pride. In fact, even what day after Father's Day, here we are. It's a tremendous. It's a matter of tremendous pride to have Josh has been chosen as Coach of the Year of the SEC, which is obviously one of the top conferences in this country right now, and such a young age to be voted by his peers as the Coach of the Year. He was also elected the regional coach of the year as well on top of that. So it really has been a tremendous pride to see him follow my footsteps and carrying the torch with such a tremendous grace and capability, really. But so I am kind of always careful about talking about Josh's accomplishments, because I sometimes people may think that I'm proud of him just for his accomplishments in tennis, but that's far from the truth. I'm most proud of him for his accomplishments as an individual, the person that he is, and he turned out as an adult going through junior tennis, pretty much like your son is, and possibly all of the listeners' kids as well. My situation with Josh was slightly different than possibly yours and our listeners.
Okay.
And I will share with you a little bit about that. I published this book, Tournament Tough, with McEnroe in 1984, when McEnroe was on the top of the game. Those of you that know about the history of the game, in '84, John was not only the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, but differently than our top guys today. And I have tremendous respect for all of the top four players of our days today. I mean, no question about it. They are phenomenal tennis players, and they represent our game with fantastically. They are great representatives of our game, our top four. However, with all due respect, they are great tennis players. Mac in '84 not only was a great tennis player, but he was a tremendous celebrity on top of it all. That actually had at that point transcended the game of tennis, his celebrity status. So when Mac and I decided to put together in writing, there were no tennis books directed to junior tennis at all that had been written up until that point. So there were a lot of questions, obviously. How did John McEnroe become so good? Because he really was an unorthodox type of a junior player, and went through the ranks in a very unorthodox manner, and he became number one in the world. And people wanted to know, how is this possible, and such a celebrity? And we put together that book to actually share our views about junior tennis development. And it was quite interesting because the book, if you've read, Lisa, talks very little about technique. And focus, we purposely was to talk about strategy and tactics and the whole mental aspect of the competitive tennis, rather than focus on technique, which most of the books up to that point would only deal with technique. So, but coming back to Josh in junior tennis, I was just saying that when the book was published, Josh was very young at that point. Josh is from 1979. So he was only 4 or 5 years old when the book was published, and it was a big deal in those days not because of Carlos Goffi by far, but certainly with the name McEnroe on the book, it became, it was sold in every country in the world. It was translated into 6-7 languages, and it was a pretty big deal in those days. And I immediately started a tennis camp following the book because there was a lot of interest in those days for parents of junior players to have access to my coaching at that point. And I started this summer camp, which was a very successful and a large summer camp in those days in the mid-'80s. Following this,
and you were down in Florida at that point already, right?
At that point, yes. Yes, at that point we had the camp for 4 years here at Orange Lake Country Club in Orlando. Then we went down to Bonaventure Resort and Spa in Fort Lauderdale and moved around a little bit the camp, because the camp kept growing and we needed different facilities for the camp. But the funny thing about it is this, and here I am, just enjoying success for the release of the book, and having a son that is 5 years old, 6 years old, and running these camps for the top juniors that were coming in from all over the country, different parts of the world, ranked junior players. And Josh is growing up with these kids during the summer, and these kids. By the time Josh is 8, 9 years old, the kids would begin to ask, Josh, how come you're not playing tennis? How come you're not playing tennis? Well, see, I had to use what we call reverse psychology with my son, and because I am Brazilian and and his mom is American. I used to bring Josh to Brazil every year to visit, of course, my parents and his relatives there. And I used to take him to these big soccer games, big soccer stadiums, and in Brazil, which is pandemonium. When they score a goal there in Brazil, it's just like fireworks everywhere inside of the stadium, inside of the soccer stadium. It's really a huge spectacle, soccer matches in Brazil. So I used to take him to these soccer games, and when we used to get back to the United States here, he would be playing in these soccer little leagues that every kid in America plays. Tuesday and Thursdays practice, Saturday, they suit up and they play against another team. And I did that with Josh when he was 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, and he was playing soccer. And so when we would go to the camp, and the camp in those days were like 2 months long, and the kids would ask him, Josh, how come you're not playing tennis yet? He says, well, I'm a soccer player. Because I used to tell him, I said, Josh, you don't want to play tennis. Come on, look at how wonderful this game of soccer is. I mean, beautiful field. Imagine one day you're playing for the Brazilian national team wearing that nice yellow jerseys of the Brazilian national team. I said, tennis is boring compared to soccer. Please, continue to play soccer. You have Brazilian blood in your veins. You can be in the national team one of these days. Just trying to keep him away from the game, because at that point, the last thing I wanted to do, Lisa, to be very frank with you, is to be able to take my son to 10 and unders and 12 and under tournaments, in South Carolina, to be frank with you. I did not want him to have that kind of pressure, being the son of a sort of an author and coach that was enjoying sort of a success in my coaching career, and I did not want him to feel that pressure while he was on the court, you see. And so it was funny because he used to tell everybody that, I prefer to play tennis. I play soccer than tennis. Soccer is my sport. Until such a day, and that day was when he was 14 years old. He had just shot up to almost a 6-footer, and his feet just shot up to size 14 when he turned 14. So this kid just went through from a little boy to a man size when he was 14. And I remember this day vividly because I told him that this was the most important day of his life and my life. I went to wake him up at 6 o'clock in the morning, like I did every morning, to get him, the kids ready to take him to school. And when I touched him and I said, Josh, time to get up. And he kind of says, I'm so tired, and they beat me up last night on the soccer field so bad, man. My knees are hurting. And he was half asleep, and he says, Dad, I'm quitting soccer, and I'm starting to play tennis.
Oh, my gosh. So, just like that.
Yeah, just like that. And he was still half asleep. So I kind of held him up by the arm and said, Josh, wake up. What did you say? He says, I just said that I'm getting beaten up on the soccer field. I'm quitting soccer. I'm starting to play tennis now. I said, well, I want you to know that this is the most important day of our lives, yours and mine. And he didn't quite understand that, but I made sure he understood it. And I said, I want you to know that you are making the decision this morning to quit playing soccer, and you're making the decision to play tennis. And I've never asked you to play tennis, and I've never even expected you to play tennis. So we want to make sure that we never forget today. So that day, he didn't really understand the magnitude of that day, but that is the point that I'm trying to make to your readers, to every parent that is listening, is that I made absolutely sure that my son owned his game from that moment forward, that was his game, his decision, and that he had absolutely nothing to prove to anybody, much less to his parent, about tennis. In fact, I told him, I said, you've been around tennis since you were born, the minute you were born, you've been around tennis. You've seen all of the stuff that goes on in a tennis match, the individuality of the sport, and why I told you that soccer is a beautiful sport for you, because you're in a team situation. When the team loses, 3-0, you guys, we all end up at Pizza Hut having fun, having pizza and a Coca-Cola with all the parents and all the kids. They just got waxed, and everybody's happy. But in a tennis match, a tennis tournament, you lose love and love. It looks like somebody died in the family, So it's a completely different animal than a team sport. And I want you to own this. It's your game. It's your deal. I didn't ask you to play. You want to play tennis. I'll do everything I can to help you. But you got to understand that that's your game. That's your choice right now. And I take this approach very seriously, Lisa, because until a kid is self-motivated, the kid cannot be a champion. And to get to the point of a kid to be self-motivated, that kid needs to own the game as his own thing, that he doesn't need to do that to please anybody other than himself. And until you get that across and that in the DNA of that junior tennis player, you're never going to get a player that will reach his or her potential.
Well, let me ask you a question, because I agree with you 1,000%, and I'm just wondering, because Josh started, what many people would consider really late, age 14. Did you have to remind him that it was his choice ever?
No, I did. You know what? I only had to remind him that it was his choice when he had some bad losses, like we all do. And and when he had bad losses, and when junior players get so frustrated that you end up with a bad loss, you just basically want to blame anything in the world and everything in the world for your loss. And in those days, I used to remind him, look, you remember that day when I woke you up and you said that you wanted to play tennis? So listen, it's your choice. Get your head back up and let's move on. So the other thing that I would say to you, Lisa, and to the parents that are listening, is that quite frankly, a lot of people may disagree with what I have to say here, but I'm going to tell you, and I will put myself on the line because I believe that thoroughly, is that what you want to do with a child that is going to play tennis before he or she reaches physical maturity as well as some kind of an emotional maturity to handle the individualistic aspect of our game. You don't want that kid to be in our game that seriously until physically and emotionally they can handle an individual sport, you see. And in a team sport like soccer or basketball or volleyball, what have you, it's a much better way to hone your skills as a competitor, as an athlete, as a kid growing up and having to deal with the teammates and all of that. That's a much healthier way to develop an athlete through team sports up until the kid is about 14, or in some of the instances, girls actually mature emotionally and physically earlier than 14. But certainly boys don't, because they go through that whole spurt at 14 years old with the Osgood-Schlatter problems on the knees and all of that kind of stuff. And when you put a kid that is not physically or emotionally capable of handling, a tennis battle one-on-one, you start getting into all sorts of bad habits, all sorts of bad things that normally you shouldn't, because you will hold you back. You will scar you, and it has scarred so many people, so many kids, because in that period of 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, they have so many bad experiences that have absolutely nothing to do with the experience that they're going to have at 14 and up, because they're different players. They're playing a different tennis at that point, you see. So I am...
Sorry, let me just ask you, so is your approach then that kids should not be playing tournaments before the age of 14, or not be playing... I mean, should they be training as tennis players before 14 and just not competing? I just want to make sure I'm understanding clearly.
And I appreciate that. Yes, I appreciate that. And I'll go on a limb by saying that I actually have been through full circle, and I can speak, certain of my experience that I've had as a junior player myself, when I was back as a junior player back in the early 60s in Brazil, and then later on in the, as I was telling you, in the late 80s and early 90s with Josh, with my own son, having to do this,
right.
With my own son as a parent, but now as a coach, and the one that has gone through all of it. When I went through as a junior, my parents had not gone through, junior tennis. They didn't play junior tennis when they were juniors. My father was a lawyer, and as I said, president of the club. And my mom, was a wonderful mom, but never had played competitive tennis. Both of them were just very social club players that came in and played little doubles once a week, with their friends at the club, but never even went to a tennis tournament before. So when I went through junior tennis, and a lot of parents are the same as my own parents,
Sure.
They never played competitive tennis, and then all of a sudden, they've got a little guy or a little girl that they think there's going to be a little Rafa Nadal or another Maria Sharapova, and there's a totally, illusion at that point, and something that a lot of parents don't realize the damage that it can cause to a young kid that is not physically or emotionally prepared to handle the pressures of an individual game like tennis, because they themselves did not go through. So how could they understand what the kid is going through out there?
Right.
Because, from the outside, how simple is it, this game? We sit outside on the bleachers and say, how could he miss that shot? How could he not beat this kid? It's very easy from that. When we sit outside, the game is nothing. But, getting inside out there and start feeling those butterflies that these kids feel, and start feeling all of the emotions that these kids go through, and they don't know how to deal with that because they're not prepared. They're not mature enough to be prepared to handle all of that, mega number of emotions that go through. It is, peer pressures that they suffer when they're inside that tennis court alone. It is, what is my mom and my dad, going to say after all of this? We traveled 500,000 miles and cost so much, and I just can't put a ball on the court. It's tough, for a kid alone to be handling himself or herself at that age. And in an environment where you are in a competitive sport, in a team sport, it's completely different. I mean, if you're playing soccer, you got 10 other kids out there. If you're playing basketball, you got 4 other kids out there on the court that, even though you're a little off, the coach says, "Hey, sit down here, calm down, will you, before I put you back on." So I mean, there is a completely different dynamics going on.
I'm sorry, I was going to say, I had one dad say to me this weekend, instead of spending all this money on lessons and hitting balls, I should be spending it on therapy for my kid.
Yeah, but you see?
I mean, it was funny but sad at the same time, because he was watching his son lose to somebody that his son should have been winning the match, but for whatever reason, the kid's head wasn't there that day, and I'm sure what was going through the kid's head is exactly what you're saying. What's my dad sitting over there thinking? What am I going to hear when I walk off the court? And you're right, it's terribly sad.
Yes, well, and moving on, I mean, you just mentioned something that it reminds me that I've through my camps, 29 years of summer camps, Lisa, I literally have gone through thousands and thousands of kids, competitive junior players gone through my camps for 29 years, imagine. And I've had parents and interviews and what is your best advice, for a tennis parent? What is your best advice for a tennis parent? Please tell us, what is the advice, Master? First of all, my number one advice to tennis parent is this: no talking tennis for at least 2 hours after a match, okay? That's the first advice that I have for parents. No tennis. Match is over. Okay, what would you like to do, kid, my son or my daughter? I like to be out here in the pool with my buddies, or I like to go out and have some lunch. Okay, well, you know what? We get in the car, we talk about what we're going to eat for lunch. We got to talk about if he wants to go to a movie, but there is no tennis talk for 2 hours until all of the emotions start falling, sort of come down from both sides. Because if you start talking about tennis, whether you win or lose, you should not talk about tennis after a match. No, it is not just when you lose. Even when you win, you should not talk about the match for at least 2 hours, because the emotional feelings that you're going through, win or lose after a match, makes you say things that if you have 2 hours to actually ponder, you probably will not say either way, whether after you lost or after you won. So it's very, very interesting, because even these press conferences for the top athletes that they have to make, because it's the rule of the ATP and WTA, those press conferences sometimes they don't go too well, as you've probably seen some of those, even with professional athletes, because it's just too soon after the match to be talking about the match, either way. So that's my first advice for parents. But for you to have an idea, Lisa, and the listeners as well, it's not that I did not allow Josh to pick up a racket until he was 14. I mean, I would be hitting. I mean, I was a different case with Josh and I. Were different cases than the majority of amateur parents that have not played tennis with their own kids. Because, granted, I was on top of the world as a coach at that point, a junior tennis coach at that point, and I did not want my kid to feel that pressure when he was playing at that young age. So the recipe that worked for me, which I believe it can be used even for those that are not coaches or tennis pros, dads, I think it can work for everyone, because what does a kid need between up until he or she is fully or nearly full physical and a little more maturity emotionally, is to learn how to compete, is to be a competitor. It is to become a better athlete. So these cross sports to tennis are doing the job without the pressure of the one-on-one, you see, but you're doing the same job, on a soccer field or on a basketball court and a volleyball court, because you're improving your footwork, you're improving your competitiveness, you're improving your balance, you're improving, so not only your athleticism, but your competitiveness as well. At the end of the day, those are much more important than just hitting balls, I mean, forehands and backhands and serves are the easy part of our game, that can be learned like really quickly, how to hit a ball. And I often say, that unfortunately, our game has way too many more hitters than players. And I think that's one of the reasons is because, we start the kids so early that technique becomes so important. That we end up the whole life thinking about technique. And the majority of the pros, with all the respects for my own, sort of fellow coaches and pros out there, a lot of the coaches, when they are giving private lessons to the kids, I mean, they just hone in on the technique only, and let's fix that forehand loop, or let's fix that backhand, and let's fix that serve. So everything becomes so technically oriented that the kid basically, experiences competing only when he's in a tournament, and so that really is a shock to an emotional kid that is not prepared to handle that. You see.
So if a kid has grown up playing a team sport such as soccer, baseball, or volleyball, and doesn't compete in tennis tournaments until age 14, you feel that competitive spirit that they've gleaned from the team sport translates pretty quickly over to tennis? Immediately, in a much more healthy way, in a much healthier way than if that child had been out there getting beaten up, as an individual since he was 8, 9, and 10 on the court and just driving himself crazy, and about not understanding how to handle any of that, you see. Where were you in my life 10 years ago? Well, let me tell you this, Lisa, okay? Imagine, just to prove the point. So Josh, we use Josh as an example because here it is my own son. I'm using my own son as an example. So we go down to Palm Beach when he's 14 years old after that episode that morning at home, and he says, I'm going to do the camp. I'm going to do the camp this summer, and I am going to start playing tennis. I said, good. The camp's there for you. So he goes out there after a couple of weeks of drilling in the camp and playing little challenge matches in the camp with the other kids that were like 13, 14. One of my staff members on a weekend took about a dozen kids to play one of these FTA tournaments down there in Miami. Just was one of those things that in between sessions I used to get one of my staff to take kids to play tournaments, these local tournaments. And I never went, and it was basically Josh's first tournament, and I never went. I purposely didn't even go to his first tournament, so that he would understand that that's your deal. You've got one of our staff guys that is going to go out there with you. Got all the kids here; they're your friends. Have a good time. Bye bye. So he goes out, and he comes back, with a gang. And my pro comes in, and, I see Josh and the kids coming back, and Josh has got his long face. I said, oh, boy, things did not go so well for him today, I could tell. So I looked at my staff member, and I said, how did he go? He says, went okay. So after Josh and the kids went on to the cafeteria, I said, what went on with Josh? He says, he's so mad. He double faulted his entire last game of the match. Oh. An entire game of double fault, and he says he's going to quit. And I said, oh boy, that's funny. Oh, excuse me. Trial by fire for sure. Yeah. I said that's funny. So I said, so what's next? He says, no, I already told him that after we eat dinner, I'm going to go back on the courts with him and work with his serve. Sure enough, this kid was out there with my son with a bucket of balls and hitting serves again, and we still laugh about that day because the amazing thing is 2 years later,
at Kalamazoo. He beat James Blake. For you to have an idea, how quick you can actually improve in those 2 years. By the time this kid was actually drooling to be playing in the 16s, he's still a very green player for all practical purposes, because he hadn't had the miles on the courts that all of these other kids in the 16s have had since 10 and 11, 12. So he would be misfiring shots here and there. But the competitive fire inside of him was a lot brighter than all of those other kids that were burned out by the time they were 16s. Yeah. You see, they just were burned out. It was another tournament. They've been playing tournaments since they were 10 years old. Now they're 15 years old. They're tired. And here comes a kid on the other side, hungry, drooling, not that good yet technically, but drooling to kill you, to win a match, because he was so looking forward to being competitive on a tennis court. That's what really spurts the level. It's that inner fire, and most of the kids that start early, they lose it by the time they're 15, 16. They're worn out after dealing with everything they had to deal with.
Sure. I had a dad tell me recently that I should consider myself a successful tennis parent if my son is still playing when he graduates from high school. He said, I don't care what he does post-high school tennis-wise, but if he's even still playing the game at 18, you should pat yourself on the back, because so many of these kids,
something good.
They burn out.
Well,
exactly what you said.
I would go one step farther. Not only if he's still playing tennis, but he's still talking to you.
That goes for all teenagers. I don't care if they play tennis or otherwise. Yeah.
But Lisa. So this is where I started. This is why I'm so proud of what Josh has done. And I started on the top of the conversation when you asked talk about Josh. And not just because of what he accomplished in tennis, but because who he is. He has done it on his own. He's done it for himself. He's done it knowing that this was his deal, that he had nothing to prove, he would not please me one way or the other. In fact, my daughter, who is 2 years older than Josh, never played tennis. And I'm glad that she never played tennis. To be fair, she's a club player. She's still today. She's 38 or 7 years old, and she plays tennis just for fun, but never played tennis tournaments. And I never asked for it. And so I'm very proud of Josh doing what he has done to get where he has gotten in tennis at such a young age, because he's done it all for himself. And perhaps that's the key of my delivery right here, on this subject, is until parents make sure that their kid own their game, that their kids have that game as their own thing, and the parents should not interfere with that game. Let that kid do what he wants to do with that game. Now in the book, I have a section for parents, as you know, and parents and players. And I've advised parents and players throughout my coaching career. Yes, there are certain things that a parent has to do in order to discipline their youngster while they're growing up in junior tennis. But those are things that violate family principles. They have nothing to do with tennis. This has to do with family principles. So let's assume that the kid that's 13 years old goes out to play a tournament, and he goes crazy and starts breaking rackets or shouting obscenities on a tennis court or cheating on a tennis court. Well, we've got to understand one thing here. This has nothing to do with tennis. This has to do about family principles. Some families would not allow their child to cheat, to say obscenities, or to throw rackets, the same manner that a parent would not allow a kid to shout obscenities on a dining room table when guests are at home, or without guests, being at home, or break a plate of spaghetti because the kid lost his cool while eating dinner, or So those are issues that are family principles that cannot be violated on court or at home or in any other place, because you're trying to pass on to your children your principles as that you believe in. So a parent, in my opinion, should and do this is where the problem is. A lot of parents don't go there because they think that may hurt their kids' rankings or etc. But you go back to the history of this game, and you will see that Bjorn Borg, when he was 11 years old, for your information, Mom took his 2 rackets and put it in a behind lock and said, Bjorn, you will not touch these tennis rackets for a year, because the kid shouted an obscenity on the court playing when he was 11 years old. He stayed 1 year without touching his rackets. After that, his mom says, are you ready now to go back and play tennis and not, ever say, never do what you did a year ago? And from that point forward, I mean, those of us that know Bjorn never opened his mouth, on the tennis court, ever again, So the line was drawn right there by his mom, was drawn right there, just clear as the day. It's look, this is it. You want to play tennis, you play tennis, but you go out there and violate our family principles, you're done. You're not going to play tennis anymore. So. Right. I will tell you that I've defaulted Josh, when he was 14, just past 14, in another tournament, that he was already getting going and all that, and I went to see this tournament, and it was a big match for him, and he lost his cool, I remember. And I remember walking up and said, okay, please shake his hands, and, the match is over, and I took him out of the match. And that was a clear signal to him, this is not what tennis is. Okay, because you see, Lisa, I've got through the years, I've developed a lot of sayings, a lot of things that I get across to kids that I coach. One that is one of the most important ones is that tennis is not a personal battle. A champion needs to know that, and kids need to know that, because as an individual sport, it's so easy to turn this game into a personal battle, It's like the kid out there hooked you, then the other one is showing the other one a fist, and, all of this personal battle, that gets transformed from a tennis match because the blood is heated, that it has nothing to do with being a tennis player or a tennis champion. A tennis champion is one that knows how to play the game, knows how to win by understanding what it takes to win, and never making that a personal battle. And this is, unfortunately, a big problem in junior tennis, because the kids are out there. Yeah, the kids are out there on their own. They are so desperate to win that, parents are out there, look, in that same Orange Bowl that I told you, that I came to the United States in 1969, believe me or not, Dick Stockton's father ended up in a fist fight with Harold Solomon's father on the sidelines, and both of them ended up in jail. Yeah.
Wow.
So this is not something new, modern tennis. This goes back to my days as well, parents getting, in fights with other parents on the sideline. Total mayhem, total chaos for a kid that is 14, 16 years old to be involved in. So it's important that the kid has a line, drawing the line. Look, you're going to play junior tennis. This is your game. You do whatever you do, good or bad. It's you. It's not because of my money or because I invested the money, because I bought you the new racket, because I bought you. The last thing a parent should do is to treat their child differently after a win or a loss. That is the biggest mistake parents make right there. You should have one exact same manner after win or a loss. Do not change. It doesn't matter if they lost or won. You have to behave exactly the same. Otherwise, you'll be sending wrong signals to kids, because there's so many parents that when a kid wins a match, they're ready quickly to make reservations in the best restaurant in town, and and they're calling everybody that my kid won 2-2, is in the semifinals. And then all of a sudden, when the kid loses, they don't talk to the kid for a week. So, what kind of a signal are you sending to the kid at this point? Is he going to be a champion? No. I can guarantee you that kid is never going to be a champion.
But that's such a hard task, and I've addressed that issue on the show and in my blog, several times over the past couple of years. As a parent, you can't help but be emotionally invested in what your child is doing out there. good or bad. And the challenge is to maintain a stony face, to maintain a calm body language and all of that. But it is hard. It's really hard. And it's a skill I think that we as parents have to work on developing the same way our kids work on developing their tennis skills.
Absolutely. All of them, parents and kids, are actually learning, how to be in junior tennis. You're absolutely correct. But I want to, before the show is over, I also like to make a point right here that I think is important for parents as well. Is that,
okay.
And I humbly submit, when I am introduced, as you did, and believe me, I'm not faulting you at all, but when I'm introduced around the world, to speak at a conference or to whatever, to do a radio show like I'm doing with you, of course, the former coach of John McEnroe. And to be frank with you, I've humbly submitted through the years that actually I've learned how to coach from John. The other way around. It's not necessarily that I coached him. He coached me how to be a coach. And I will give you a summary of my relationship with Mac and how that happened. I graduated from college. I went out to play on the tour in those days, 1973. I don't know if people even know that there was no ATP until the end of 73. So there were no world rankings. There were computer points until the end of 73. There were only rankings, national rankings, like Brazil had 1 through 10, and the United States had 1 through 10. And for you to have an idea, when I played qualies at Wimbledon, the way to get into Wimbledon in those days that I was playing college tennis here was that the president of my federation wrote a letter to the tournament director at Wimbledon saying that, the Brazilian Tennis Federation would like to endorse such and such and such and such players for Wimbledon, and I was one of those guys, and the tournament director would make a decision whether I would be in the main draw or in the qualies, just by pure subjective type of a choice. That was, how it was in those days. So, so after I graduated, I played a series of 8 months of tournaments in Europe, and to make a long story short, I just decided I was not going to continue to play, and I wanted to start a family. My wife at that point was pregnant with Jordan, our daughter, and time to quit this traveling around in Europe, and let's just settle down and where am I going to start teaching tennis to make a living so I can have start my family. So I called Harry Hopman. Mr. Hopman was an Australian coach, known as the best coach ever in tennis. For those who do not know about Mr. Hopman was the coach of the Australian Davis Cup team that won 18 Davis Cups in a row in Australia. And Mr. Hopman, actually, I had a run-in with Mr. Hopman when I was a junior player at the National Junior Indoors. He came to talk to me and so forth. So long story short, when I was finishing up my professional tennis career post-college, where am I going to go to start making a living to raise a family? I called Mr. Hopman from Denmark, as a matter of fact, to New York. I knew he had about a year or 2 years before, he was the director of this junior tennis academy in New York, which I didn't even know where it was at that point, but I found out where it was, made a call, and he was the director of Port Washington Tennis Academy in Long Island. So I asked Mr. Hopman if I could come in and work for him, and I explained to him my situation. He says, of course. I ended up coming into New York, and as I was actually coming in from Europe and until I got to New York, Mr. Hopman ended up having to have hip surgery, and the cold in the Northeast was too much for him, so he came to Florida. And I ended up being hired as one of the pros at Port Washington, even though Mr. Hopman wasn't there at that point. And fresh out of the tour, I was playing good tennis and in shape, and so the first day of my coaching career, the owner of the academy put me on this first court with 5 or 6 kids. One of those 5 or 6 kids was actually John McEnroe, and he was about 14 and a half years old at that point. Kind of a, sort of a pudgy little kid, lefty, with a frizzy hair, red headband, just sort of little timid kid. And I walked into the court and saw the kids warming up, and there were 3-4 other kids on the court at that point. And this is my first lesson. What am I going to do as a coach? I've never went to learn how to be a coach. I'm a player basically. So I walk in and I say, what am I going to do? In this session right here with these kids. So I watch these kids warming up the overheads, and I see a couple of them missed some overheads and all of that. And I said, how creative. Let's start out, just with a bang right now, your first day as a coach on the court. So I bring the kids to the net, and I said, well, look, guys, it's a pleasure to be here with you guys, and, saw you guys warming up. You're hitting the ball pretty good, but I saw you missed a couple of overheads. So let's start out by talking overheads. I kind of gave him my spiel about what I thought about overheads and said, I'm going to do a drill here. I'm gonna toss 10 lobs for each one of you, and let's see how many of those 10 overheads you guys do right, each one of you. Kids are looking at me as the pro on the court, and go back out there. I push my cart back, to my side, get the first kid up, and I toss 10 lobs, and the kid made 5 overheads. Second kid comes in, makes 5, 6 overheads in there. Then comes Mac. Mac comes up, I send him a lob, and he goes up there, and he snaps the first one, beautiful overhead. I push him out wide to the other side of the court with a second one. He goes out there and just nails the second overhead. When I toss my third lob, he starts going up for the overhead, and all of a sudden he holds his hamstring like I pulled my hamstring, and lifts his arm up and starts walking to the sidelines into the bench, like sitting down. Don't want to go on for the rest of the 10 lobs. I knew he was a total fake. So I called him up to the net. I said, wait a minute now. What happened here? What are you doing? I mean, we still got 7 to go here. He says, no, my leg. I said, no, your leg's not hurting, okay? So why don't you want to do this drill? So he looks at me timidly like this, a 14 years old, to a guy that is like, I was 24, 23 at that point, And he looked at me and he goes, when do you hit more than 2 overheads in a point in a match? So, I mean, that hit me like a ton of bricks, okay? Right. That hit me like a ton of bricks. I looked at this kid, and I am thinking, oh, my God, So I go to the other kids. Everybody here? No more of this drill. Makes absolutely no sense what I'm doing. Mac told me that makes absolutely no sense, and he's completely right. So from that day, Lisa, my philosophy of coaching was based on that very day, that everything that we did drill-wise had to simulate points of a match. Otherwise, there's no reason to practice. See, Mac never hit 300 forehands cross-court. Because, just like he told me, when do you hit more than 2 overheads in a point in a match? I ask you, when do you hit 300 forehands nonstop, in a match? You don't. Then you take it to the next level, and you go, okay, you can hit that forehand 300 times, that same forehand. And you know what? Tomorrow when you're playing a match, and it's 3-4, 30-40, you're going to miss the exact same forehand because you did not practice that forehand that was at 3-4, 30-40. You practiced a forehand, but which forehand did you practice? You see what I'm saying? So from that point forward, from that point forward, everything that was done simulating match conditions, and the kids were competing in a court against each other. So from that point forward, our sessions were, competitive. Everybody was into it because everybody was doing the things that they know that they needed when they came to a match. And I'm going to close this episode about how to practice by telling you that the way that a kid should be practicing serves before a match is not like the majority of the kids still today do. They go out to the tennis club, they pick up a basket of balls, and they go out there and start banging serves, so they can get the serve ready for tomorrow's match. So then I go in and I said, what are you doing? I'm practicing my serve. And I'm saying, which serve? And he goes, my first. And I'm going, which first? Because, the first at 30 love is completely different than the first at love 30. And the first at 30 all is completely different than the first at 45. So, which first are you practicing? So the way to practice serves to be effective in a match is what I did back then in Port Washington. I did then with my own son. I did then with John and Patrick. Patrick, through the years that I coached Patrick on the tour. Before big matches, we used to go on the tennis court, and this drill was always done before a match. You play 6 games against himself. So you pick a target, and you go out there like a target in that box, and you come up and you serve your first point, 0-0, just like you would start a game with your serve. You certainly don't want to go and put your pedal to the metal on a 0-0 point. You want to start with a 3/4 first serve because you don't want to start the game showing your second serve to an opponent that immediately gets aggressive against your second serve in the first point. So you got to get that first serve 3/4 pace and make sure that he's in to guarantee your 15 love. Then you step on the gas a little more. So you learn how to serve through the whole game according to the pressures and according to the score. By practicing serve that way, you put your first serve in at the right speed, but not at the target that you had chosen. That means that you missed the first serve, so you got to throw that second in there. If the second goes in at the right target, the way you want it, it's 15 love. Otherwise, it's love 15, and so on and so on. Because this way, you're practicing the serves exactly with the same simulated pressures of the scores that you're going to need to feel comfortable to serve that serve during a match. If you follow me.
Absolutely. That's so smart. That's the first time I've ever heard that.
Well, that's what makes, what player have confidence on serving a second serve at 15-30 is if you've already gone through that situation, in practice, and freshly in your mind that you can actually hit that second serve at 5:30 because you just had a couple of games, yesterday that you did that serve, so it's nicely fresh in your mind that you can handle it.
I love that. Well, we are out of time, unfortunately, and I don't know about you, but I would certainly love to have you come back on again and continue this conversation because I have learned an incredible amount from you today, Carlos, and I'm just so grateful to you for taking time out. I know you're a busy guy and sharing your wealth of knowledge with us, and I want to just urge my readers, a link to your book is available on parentingaces.com on our books page, and I hope everyone will take a look. The book was just re-released as in an e-version, so it's very simple. Load it onto your Kindle or your iPad and take a look and learn even more from Carlos and his massive amounts of wisdom. Carlos, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your Monday. And again, thank you so much for being with us today.
Lisa, it was my pleasure to be here with you. And as you can tell, talking 1 hour only about junior tennis for me is just really, I'm getting warmed up. So, yes, let's do another session another time, okay? And you stay safe on the road, okay?
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. To the rest of my listeners, have a great week. The link to the podcast for today's show will be online as soon as I get back to Atlanta, which will be about 4 hours from now. So check it out, and you'll be able to share it with your junior tennis friends. And, again, thank you to Carlos. I look forward to speaking to the rest of you next week. Have a great one, everybody. Signing off.
I'm Lisa Stone, and you've been listening to the Parenting Aces podcast. For tennis parents, by a tennis parent. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to us and write a review on iTunes. For more information on navigating the junior and college tennis journey, visit us online at parentingaces.com. As always, a huge thank you to our sponsor, tennisballs.com.